Beatrice's hands shook so violently she could barely hold the receiver. The screaming from the formal dining room had finally stopped, and the dead silence that followed was somehow worse. She dialed the one number she was strictly forbidden to call during business hours. When the deep, gravelly voice answered, Beatrice didn't bother with a greeting. She just choked back a sob and whispered, "Please come home now. She'll destroy her." Dominic expected a massacre, but when he kicked the front door open, the reality paralyzed him. The smell of ammonia and stale copper hung thick in the air of the meatpacking warehouse. Dominic Gallo sat at the head of a rusted aluminum table, his posture relaxed, his dark eyes entirely devoid of warmth. Across from him, the Russo brothers sweated through their tailored suits. They were talking in circles, making excuses for a shipment that had vanished somewhere between the docks and the distribution center. Dominic didn't care about the excuses. He cared about the timeline. He tapped his index finger against the face of his watch. The heavy steel Rolex made a dull, rhythmic, clinking sound against the table. "You're giving me weather reports, Thomas," Dominic said, his voice barely above a murmur. The cavernous room amplified it anyway. "I didn't ask about the storm off the coast. I asked where the crates are." Thomas Russo opened his mouth, likely to offer another lie. But the sharp, intrusive vibration of a phone cut him off. It wasn't a burner. It was Dominic's personal line. The heavy phone sat face down next to his left hand. Only 3 people in the world had that number. 2 of them were currently standing directly behind him, with suppressed weapons under their coats. The third was Nora. Dominic's jaw tightened. He picked up the device. The caller ID didn't say Nora. It read, "Home Kitchen." A spike of pure, unadulterated cold shot through his chest. Beatrice, the housekeeper, knew the rules. She was a woman in her 60s who had worked for his family for 2 decades. She knew that a call to this phone during a sit-down meant someone was dead or dying. Dominic held up a hand. The Russo brothers snapped their mouths shut. The warehouse fell deathly silent, save for the hum of a distant industrial freezer. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Speak, Mr. Gallo," Beatrice breathed. Her voice was thin, fractured. The sound of weeping echoed faintly in the background. "You need to come back to the house, right now." Dominic stood up. His chair scraped violently against the concrete. Behind him, his men shifted, their hands dropping to their waistbands. "Who is in the house, Beatrice? Did the perimeter alarm trip?" No alarm," she stammered, her breathing erratic. "It's Miss Vivian. She bypassed the gate security. She just walked right in. She cornered Nora in the drawing room." Vivian. Dominic's blood turned to ice. Vivian wasn't just a former associate. She was the daughter of the West Side Syndicate's boss, a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to inflict pain. She was ruthless, bitter, and completely unhinged ever since Dominic severed their business and personal ties a year ago. Nora, on the other hand, was a civilian, an art restorer, a woman who spent her weekends reading in the conservatory and who flinched when a car backfired on the street. "Where are the guards?" Dominic demanded, already moving toward the heavy steel doors at the end of the warehouse. "Where is Frankie?" I don't know, Beatrice sobbed. "I heard a crash, then shouting. Miss Vivian was screaming about taking what was hers. Then came the breaking glass. Please come home now. She'll destroy her." The line went dead. Dominic didn't say a word to the Russos. He didn't look at his men. He just broke into a dead sprint. He burst through the warehouse doors into the driving rain, his mind playing out every horrific scenario. Vivian had a penchant for knives. She liked to leave marks. The thought of Nora, quiet, gentle Nora, with her paint-stained fingers and soft smiles, locked in a room with a predator, made Dominic's chest physically ache. It was a suffocating pressure, a panic he hadn't felt since he was a child, bleeding in the gutters of his old neighborhood. He reached his armored SUV and threw the driver out of the seat before the man could even put the car in park. "Get in the back!" Dominic barked. Tires screamed against the wet asphalt as Dominic threw the heavy vehicle into gear. He tore out of the industrial park, completely ignoring the red lights of the city intersections. The windshield wipers beat a frantic, rhythmic tempo, struggling against the torrential downpour. His grip on the leather steering wheel turned his knuckles entirely white. He navigated the slick streets with reckless, terrifying precision. Every second felt like an hour. He replayed Beatrice's words in his head. "She'll destroy her." He knew what Vivian was capable of. He had seen her dismantle grown men, both physically and psychologically. She was a hurricane of spite. She had promised Dominic she would ruin the one thing that finally gave him a semblance of peace. He had doubled the security at the estate. He had put Nora in a gilded cage to keep her safe, and now the monster had just walked through the front door. He thought of the way Nora looked at him when he came home late, her eyes full of quiet understanding. He thought of her small frame. She wouldn't even know how to throw a punch. She would just stand there and take it. The visualization made a feral growl tear its way up his throat. Dominic swerved into the oncoming lane to bypass a line of stalled traffic, clipping the side mirror off a delivery truck. He didn't stop. He pushed the accelerator to the floor. The heavy engine roared, tearing through the wealthy suburbs leading to his estate. "Hold on," he thought, the mantra repeating in his mind like a frantic prayer. "Just hold on, Nora. I'm coming." He hit the wrought iron gates of his property at 60 miles an hour. He expected resistance, but the gates were already open. That was the first sign that everything was deeply, irreparably wrong. He slammed on the brakes, sending the SUV skidding across the crushed gravel of the circular driveway. The car hadn't even come to a complete stop before he was out the door, his heavy automatic weapon drawn, the cold rain instantly soaking his suit. The heavy oak front doors of the estate stood ajar. The security keypad on the wall had been smashed into cheap plastic shrapnel. Dominic moved with lethal, practiced silence. He kept his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the grand foyer. It was quiet. Too quiet. There was no screaming now, just the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and the faint patter of rain drifting in from outside. He found Frankie first. The imposing 200-pound security guard was slumped against the wall near the coat closet, a blooming purple bruise across his jaw. He was breathing, but unconscious. Vivian had brought heavy hitters with her. A cold sweat broke out on the back of Dominic's neck. He stepped over Frankie, his boots making no sound on the imported marble. He moved toward the drawing room, the place where Beatrice said it had all gone down. The double doors to the drawing room were closed. From underneath the heavy mahogany frame, a thin, dark liquid was seeping into the cream-colored runner rug. Blood. Dominic stopped breathing. The gun in his hand felt like a lead weight. For the first time in his adult life, the ruthless head of the Gallo family was terrified to open a door. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, bracing himself for the sight of Nora's broken body. He raised his boot and kicked the door squarely in the center. They burst open with a violent crack, slamming against the interior walls. Dominic swept into the room, sweeping his weapon left to right, ready to empty the magazine into anyone left standing. He stopped dead. The gun slowly, instinctively, lowered by an inch. The drawing room looked like a bomb had gone off inside a museum. The heavy silk drapes had been torn from their rods. The antique glass coffee table was shattered into thousands of jagged, glittering pieces scattered across the Persian rug. The bookshelves were decimated, leather-bound volumes strewn everywhere like dead birds. but it was the center of the room that made his brain stall. Vivian was on the floor. She wasn't standing over a victim. She wasn't smiling her trademark, cruel smile. She was on her hands and knees, weeping uncontrollably. Her designer trench coat was ripped down the back. Her pristine blonde hair was matted with blood and what looked like expensive scotch. Her face, usually perfectly contoured and impossibly smug, was unrecognizable. Her nose was visibly broken, leaking blood onto the rug. She was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered. Dominic stared at her, uncomprehending. He looked past the weeping woman. Sitting in his favorite leather wingback chair, surrounded by the devastation, was Nora. She wasn't dead. She wasn't even crying. Nora was leaning back, her legs crossed elegantly at the ankle. In one hand, she held a crystal tumbler with a single finger of amber liquid left in it. Her knuckles on the other hand were completely split, bleeding freely down her fingers. A heavy iron fireplace poker rested casually across her lap, the tip coated in red. Her usually neat brown hair was loose, tumbling in wild waves over her shoulders. She wore a simple white linen dress, now stained with splatters of crimson that didn't belong to her. She took a slow sip of the scotch, swallowed, and finally looked up at Dominic. Her eyes, usually warm and soft, were completely hollow. They were cold, flat, and dead, the eyes of an apex predator. "You're home early," Nora said. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't waver. It was flat and terrifyingly calm. Dominic lowered his gun completely. His mind simply couldn't bridge the gap between the woman he thought he knew and the violence he was looking at. "Nora," he started, his voice rough. Vivian let out a pathetic, keening sound on the floor. She tried to crawl toward Dominic. "Dom!" she choked out, spitting blood onto the floorboards. "Dom, please, get her away from me. She's crazy. She's a fucking psychopath." Before Dominic could move, Nora stood up. It wasn't a rushed movement. It was smooth, deliberate. Vivian flinched so hard she hit her head on the leg of a side table, curling into a tight, defensive ball, sobbing hysterically. The ruthless mob princess was completely broken. Nora walked over to Vivian. She didn't raise the poker. She didn't yell. She just crouched down so she was at eye level with the weeping woman. Nora reached out with her bloodied, bruised hand and gently, almost tenderly, tucked a strand of matted hair behind Vivian's ear. "I told you what would happen if you ever stepped foot in my house again," Nora whispered. The absolute lack of emotion in her voice sent a chill straight down Dominic's spine. "I told you I was done being quiet. Did you think I was joking, Vivian?" Vivian just shook her head frantically, squeezing her eyes shut, weeping into the carpet. Nora stood up and turned to face Dominic. She looked at the gun hanging loosely from his grip, then at the shock etched into the hard lines of his face. She didn't apologize. She didn't break down into tears now that she was safe. "Beatrice shouldn't have called you," Nora said quietly, walking toward the bar cart to pour herself another drink. She casually nudged a piece of shattered glass out of her way with a bare foot. "I had it handled." Dominic looked from the ruined enforcer on the floor to the woman pouring a drink. Beatrice's words echoed back to him, finally making sense. She'll destroy her. Beatrice hadn't been talking about Vivian destroying Nora. The maid had seen this coming. She had called to protect Vivian from Nora. "Who are you?" Dominic asked, his voice rough, the gravel heavy in his throat. He realized with a heavy, sinking clarity that he had never really known the woman sleeping in his bed. Nora took a sip of her drink, the ice clinking against the glass. She looked at him over the rim, the corners of her mouth twitching into a dark, entirely humorless smile. "I'm exactly who I needed to be to survive your world, Dominic," she said. Now, are you going to help me clean up this mess, or are you just going to stand there? The silence in the drawing room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. It smelled of iron, spilled liquor, and the sharp tang of Vivian's expensive perfume. Dominic stood frozen in the doorway. He was a man who ordered executions before his morning coffee, yet he couldn't take his eyes off the split skin on Nora's knuckles. Footsteps pounded down the main hallway. Heavy, fast, tactical. Dominic didn't turn around. He just raised his left hand, signaling his incoming men to stop. Leo, his top lieutenant, skidded to a halt at the threshold. Leo was a veteran of 2 gang wars. He had seen bodies pulled from car trunks and floating in the harbour. But when Leo looked past Dominic's shoulder and saw the weeping heiress of the West Side Syndicate bleeding on the Persian rug, his jaw visibly dropped. "Boss," Leo breathed, his hand hovering over his holster. "What happened?" "Get her up," Dominic ordered. His voice was entirely devoid of inflection. "Put a bag over her head. Take her down to the soundproof basement. Do not ask her questions. Do not speak to her." Leo nodded, snapping out of his shock. He waved 2 men inside. They hauled Vivian to her feet. She didn't fight them. Her legs dragged across the floor, leaving a faint smear of red on the hardwood. She was broken. She didn't even look at Dominic as they dragged her past him. She only stared at Nora with wide, terrified eyes. When the doors closed, leaving them alone, Nora finally set her glass down. The crystal made a sharp clack against the only intact wooden end table left in the room. "You're tracking mud onto the rug, Dominic," she said. Dominic looked down. His leather boots were caked in wet earth from the driveway. He looked back up at her. She wasn't acting. She was genuinely annoyed by the mud, completely ignoring the fact that she had just pulverized a woman with a fireplace poker. He holstered his weapon. The click of the safety echoed loudly. He walked toward her, each step deliberate, closing the distance until he stood barely a foot away. He towered over her, a massive, brooding shadow in a ruined room. Nora didn't shrink back. She tilted her chin up to hold his gaze. "You want to tell me what just happened here?" Dominic asked. The gravel in his voice was thick, dangerous. It was the tone he used during interrogations. "I defended my home," Nora replied flatly. "Vivian had 2 armed guards outside and a driver," Dominic said, gesturing to the hallway. "Frankie is out cold. You're telling me you dismantled a trained syndicate killer and her crew by yourself?" "Her men didn't come inside," Nora said. She stepped past him, walking toward the broken window where the rain was blowing in. "They stayed by the cars. Vivian wanted to humiliate me privately. She walked in alone. She slapped Beatrice. She told me she was going to carve my face up so you wouldn't want to look at me anymore." Nora paused. She reached out and touched the torn edge of the silk curtain. She was very arrogant. Arrogant people have terrible reflexes. Dominic grabbed her arm. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was firm enough to turn her back around. "You hit her with a solid iron poker, Nora. You shattered her nose. You didn't just survive. You systematically dismantled her. A civilian doesn't know how to do that." Nora looked down at his hand wrapped around her bicep. Then, slowly, she looked up into his eyes. The dead, flat look was beginning to crack, revealing a deep, roiling well of exhaustion. "You think you're the first monster I've ever met, Dominic," she whispered. The words hit him like a physical blow. He let go of her arm. "Before I met you," Nora continued, her voice dropping to a low, raw cadence, "I spent 5 years living with a man who liked to break things. Plates, chairs, my ribs. I learned how to read a room before a punch was thrown. Learned how to use whatever was closest to me to stay alive. I changed my name. I disappeared. and I swore to God I would never, ever let someone back me into a corner again. Dominic stared at her. He thought about the background check he had run on her when they first met at the gallery. It had come back perfectly clean. No debts. No criminal record. A quiet life. He realized now it was too clean. It was a scrubbed identity. "You played the quiet artist," he said, the betrayal leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "You flinched when voices were raised. You hid it. You wanted a quiet artist," Nora countered, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce heat. "You didn't want a partner, Dominic. You wanted a pet. You wanted a soft, fragile thing you could lock in a beautiful house to make you feel like you had a normal life. You didn't want my baggage. So I buried it." She stepped closer to him, the scent of scotch and copper mixed with her vanilla lotion. But Vivian didn't want a soft thing. She wanted a victim. I just reminded her that I'm not one. Nora turned away and walked toward the hallway. "I'm going to wash my hands. Figure out what you're going to tell Arthur when he realizes his daughter is locked in our basement." Dominic watched her walk away, the white linen of her dress stained with violence. He had spent the last year thinking he was protecting her from the dark reality of his life. He hadn't protected her from anything. He had just brought the darkness right to a woman who already knew how to navigate the pitch black. The master bathroom was an expanse of white marble and brass fixtures. It was designed for tranquility. Right now, it felt like a surgical theater. Dominic sat on the edge of the large, soaking tub. Nora stood between his knees. He held a small pair of silver tweezers, carefully pulling a tiny, sharp shard of glass out of the meaty part of her palm. She didn't flinch. She just stared blankly at the frosted window above the sink. He dropped the bloody sliver of glass into the ceramic sink bowl. It made a sharp tink. "That's the last of the glass," Dominic murmured. He reached for the bottle of rubbing alcohol. "This is going to burn." "Just do it," she said. Her voice was thinner now. The cold, flat armor she had worn in the drawing room was beginning to fracture. Dominic poured the alcohol over a cotton pad and pressed it firmly into her split knuckles. Nora sharply sucked in a breath through her teeth, her entire body jerking in a sudden, involuntary spasm. The adrenaline was finally leaving her system. The chemical high that had allowed her to brutally beat a mob boss's daughter was fading, leaving behind nothing but bruised flesh and cold reality. Her knees buckled slightly. Dominic dropped the cotton pad and caught her by the waist, pulling her forward until she collapsed against his chest. She felt impossibly small. For all the ferocity she had displayed downstairs, in his arms, she was trembling like a freezing child. She buried her face in the wet, rain-soaked fabric of his dress shirt. She didn't cry. She just shook, her fingers digging desperately into his shoulders. Dominic wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her loose brown hair. He smelled the iron on her. It made a primal, possessive instinct roar to life in his chest. He pressed his lips against her temple. "I've got you," he whispered into the quiet room. "I'm right here." They stayed like that for a long time. The only sound was the heavy rain beating against the roof and the uneven rhythm of Nora's breathing. Dominic kept one arm tightly secured around her waist, while his free hand slowly stroked her back, a mechanical, soothing motion. His mind was racing, calculating the catastrophic fallout of the last hour. Arthur held the west side. He controlled the docks and the import routes. Dominic controlled the center city and the unions. There had been a tense, fragile truce between their families for 3 years. Vivian had always been a wild card, a loose cannon Arthur couldn't entirely control, but she was still his blood. Arthur would not tolerate his daughter being beaten and thrown in a basement. It didn't matter that she had trespassed. It didn't matter that she had attacked first. In their world, blood demanded blood. This meant war. A loud, ugly, protracted war that would spill into the streets. Nora shifted, pulling back slightly to look at his face. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the exhaustion etched deeply into the delicate lines of her face. "What happens now?" she asked. The tremor in her voice was nearly gone, replaced by a weary resignation. "I call a cleaner for the drawing room," Dominic said, reaching over to pick up a roll of white gauze. He took her injured hand and began wrapping it with precise, methodical movements. "I send Beatrice away to her sister's house in Connecticut until this blows over. And I prepare my men. Arthur won't let this go." "No," Dominic agreed softly. He secured the end of the tape. "He won't." Nora looked down at her bandaged hand. "I ruined your truce." Dominic stopped. He reached up, cupping her face with his heavy, calloused hand. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, wiping away a smear of Vivian's blood that had transferred there. "You didn't ruin anything," Dominic said, his tone uncompromising. "Vivian made a choice to walk through that door." "She forced your hand." He looked deeply into her eyes, searching for the terrified civilian he thought he knew, but only finding a hardened survivor looking back. "I was a fool, Nora. I thought I was keeping you safe by keeping you blind." "I was never blind," she whispered. "I just chose to close my eyes. It felt nice for a little while, pretending to be normal." "There is no normal for us anymore," Dominic said. He let his hand drop from her face. The reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He stood up, towering over her once again. "I need to go down to the basement. I need to make Vivian talk. I need to know exactly who drove her here and who knows she's inside this house. If her crew is waiting outside the gates, we have a problem." Nora nodded. She didn't beg him to stay. She didn't ask him what he was going to do to Vivian in the dark. She just reached over and grabbed a clean towel to wipe the remaining water off her face. "Dominic!" she called out, just as he reached the bathroom door. He turned back. Nora looked at him, her spine straight, the exhaustion masked by a sudden, rigid determination. "If Arthur sends his men here, I don't need you to lock me in a panic room. I can hold my own." Dominic looked at the small, fragile-looking woman in the ruined linen dress. He remembered the shattered coffee table. He remembered the heavy iron poker. A slow, dark smile crept onto his face, a genuine smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "I know you can," Dominic said softly. He turned and walked down the hallway, descending into the dark beneath the house. The war had already started. He just had to make sure they finished it. The air in the basement was heavy, tasting of copper and damp concrete. There were no windows, no natural light to mark the passage of time. The only illumination came from a single, caged industrial bulb swinging gently overhead, casting harsh, jagged shadows against the soundproofed walls. Dominic paused at the bottom of the wooden stairs, his hand resting lightly on the cold steel of the reinforced door. He took a slow, deep breath, compartmentalizing the man who had just bandaged his lover's hands and pulling forward the man who ran the city's underground. He pushed the heavy door open. It swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. Vivian sat in the center of the room. Leo had strapped her wrists and ankles to a heavy, bolted-down steel chair, using thick plastic zip ties. Her designer trench coat had been discarded in a corner, leaving her in a ruined silk blouse that clung to her shivering frame. The swelling on her face had worsened. Her nose was crooked, the skin around her eyes a deep, angry violet. She looked up when the door opened, flinching violently at the sudden influx of light from the hallway. Dominic didn't speak. He dragged a metal folding chair from the corner, setting it down directly in front of her. The scrape of metal against concrete made Vivian grind her teeth. He sat down, leaning his forearms on his thighs, his large hands clasped loosely between his knees. He just stared at her. 5 minutes passed. The silence stretched until it became a physical pressure in the room. Vivian broke first. She always did. She lacked the discipline of her father. She thrived on intimidation. But when stripped of her power, she had nothing but raw, undisciplined panic. "My father is going to skin you alive for this," she hissed. Her voice was nasal and thick from the broken cartilage. "He's going to burn that stupid house to the ground with you and that psycho bitch inside it." Dominic didn't blink. "Your father is a businessman, Vivian. He understands leverage. He understands consequences. You are currently entirely devoid of both." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, silver folding knife. Vivian's eyes widened, tracking the metal as Dominic casually flicked it open. He didn't move toward her. He just used the sharp tip to clean dirt from beneath his thumbnail. "I didn't invite you here," Dominic said, his voice a low, rumbling monotone. "You bypassed a security gate. You assaulted my staff. You threatened my family. Under the old rules, Arthur couldn't do a damn thing if I sent you back to him in pieces." "You wouldn't dare," she spat, though her chin trembled. "You don't want a war with the West Side." "I don't," Dominic agreed easily, snapping the knife shut and sliding it back into his pocket. "But I will not lose a war with the West Side. That is the difference between your father and me. He fights for pride. I fight for eradication. Now, you are going to tell me exactly who came with you." Vivian jutted her chin out, looking away. "Go to hell." Dominic sighed. It was a tired, heavy sound. He stood up slowly. "Leo," he called out to the closed door. The door opened instantly. Leo stepped inside, his expression blank. "Bring down the bolt cutters," Dominic said, not taking his eyes off Vivian. "And a bucket." Vivian's bravado cracked completely. Her breathing hitched, turning into rapid, shallow pants. Wait, Dominic, stop." He raised a hand. Leo froze in the doorway. "It was just Jimmy and Sal," she blurted out, the words tripping over themselves in her desperation. "They drove me. They're parked half a mile down the access road, waiting by the old cell tower. I told them to give me an hour inside." "Does Arthur know you're here?" Dominic asked. "No." She swallowed hard, coughing as the dried blood in her throat caught. "No. He thinks I'm at the casino. He told me to leave you alone. He said the truce was too profitable." Dominic digested this. It was exactly the kind of reckless, stupid maneuver he expected from her. She wanted to hurt him privately, thinking she could handle Nora effortlessly, leave her bleeding, and slip away before anyone was the wiser. She hadn't counted on the woman in the linen dress holding a fireplace poker. "You underestimated her," Dominic said quietly. A flash of genuine terror crossed Vivian's bruised face. "She isn't human, Dominic. I brought a knife. I pulled it on her. She didn't even scream. She just looked at my hand, stepped inside my guard, and shattered my wrist on the edge of the mantelpiece. Who the hell did you marry?" "Someone who knows exactly what to do with a rat," Dominic said coldly. He turned his back on her, walking toward the door. "You can't just leave me down here," Vivian shrieked, struggling against the zip ties, the plastic biting deeply into her wrists. Dominic, please." He stopped at the threshold and looked over his shoulder. "You're going to sit in the dark, Vivian. You're going to sit here and think very carefully about the fact that the only reason you are still breathing is because I walked through those doors when I did. If I had been, 10 minutes later, Nora would have beaten you to death." He stepped out, letting the heavy steel door slam shut behind him. The deadbolt slid with a definitive, hollow echo. Dominic looked at Leo. "Send a crew to the old cell tower down the access road. Jimmy and Sal are waiting in an SUV. I want them taken quietly. Use suppressors. Take the vehicle to the scrapyard and crush it. If they fight, drop them in the quarry. If they surrender, lock them in the shipping containers at the docks." Leo nodded, pulling his phone from his pocket. "And the girl?" "She stays," Dominic said, rubbing a hand across his tired jaw. "We need her alive. She's the only bargaining chip we have when Arthur realizes she isn't at the casino." "Boss," Leo said, hesitantly, lowering the phone. "Arthur is going to find out. Even if we scrub the crew outside, he'll trace her last steps. The casino cameras will show she left with Jimmy and Sal." "I know," Dominic said. He started walking up the stairs, the wet concrete steps slick beneath his boots. "Put the estate on total lockdown. Nobody in or out. Issue heavy rifles to the perimeter guards. We have maybe 6 hours before Arthur connects the dots. When he does, all hell is going to break loose." The kitchen was impossibly bright compared to the basement. The overhead recessed lighting reflected off the pristine granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. Dominic walked in, expecting to find the room empty. Instead, Nora was standing at the large island. She had changed. The bloody white dress was gone. In its place, she wore faded denim jeans and a simple black long-sleeved shirt. Her bare feet were planted firmly on the heated tile floor. Her freshly bandaged right hand rested awkwardly on the counter, while her left hand carefully poured boiling water into a French press. She looked up as Dominic entered. The flat, dead expression from the drawing room had faded, replaced by a grounded, vigilant exhaustion. "Coffee?" she offered. Her voice was steady. Dominic didn't answer immediately. He walked across the kitchen, closing the distance between them. He stopped just inches away, reaching out to gently push a damp strand of brown hair behind her ear. "You should be resting," he said, the roughness in his voice softening slightly. "I can't sleep," Nora replied, pressing the plunger down on the coffee maker with slow, measured pressure. "Every time I close my eyes, my brain starts running tactical drills. It's an old habit." Dominic poured 2 mugs from the cabinet, sliding one toward her. Vivian talked. Her backup was waiting down the road. Leo is handling them right now. "Arthur doesn't know she's here. Yet," Nora corrected. She picked up the mug with both hands, letting the ceramic warm her chilled skin. She looked out the large bay window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the sprawling lawns of the estate blanketed in a thick, oppressive fog. "He'll find out. Men like Arthur don't lose things without turning the world upside down to find them." "He won't touch you," Dominic said. It wasn't a comfort. It was a vow. Nora took a sip of the bitter, black coffee. She didn't look at him with gratitude. She looked at him with the cold realism of someone who had survived monsters before. "Dominic," she said softly, setting the mug down. "If Arthur sends a hit squad, they won't knock. They'll come through the windows. They'll use incendiaries. You have 12 men on this property. It's not enough to hold off a coordinated siege from the west side." He knew she was right. "I have 50 more men in the city. I'm calling them in. If you pull your men from the city, Arthur will take your territory while you're pinned down here," Nora pointed out. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms over her chest. "He'll burn your business to the ground, and then he'll starve us out." Dominic narrowed his eyes, studying her. She wasn't panicking. She was strategizing. The woman who used to ask him to help pick out paint colors for the guest room was currently analyzing a syndicate turf war with the cold precision of a general. "What are you suggesting?" Dominic asked. I'm suggesting we don't wait for him to realize she's missing, Nora said. Her eyes were dark, calculating. We call him. Dominic stared at her. You want me to call Arthur and tell him I have his daughter chained to the floor? No, Nora said. She reached across the counter and tapped her index finger against the face of Dominic's heavy steel Rolex. I want me to call him. Before Dominic could argue, the harsh, electronic ringing of the kitchen landline shattered the quiet. They both froze. The landline was an archaic system, wired directly into the estate's main gate security. It only rang if someone was physically standing at the call box outside the property line. Dominic moved instantly, stepping in front of Nora, shielding her with his broad shoulders. He reached out and grabbed the receiver off the wall mount, pressing the speaker button. Speak! Dominic barked. Static crackled through the cheap speaker, followed by the heavy, wet sound of a man breathing in the humid air. Dominic, a voice rasped. It was a voice that sounded like gravel dragging across rusted iron. It was a voice that had ordered the deaths of hundreds of men over 3 decades. Arthur. The blood in Dominic's veins turned instantly to ice. He looked at Nora. Her posture immediately stiffened, her chin lifting marginally. Arthur, Dominic replied, keeping his tone perfectly level. To what do I owe the pleasure of a call at my personal gate? And where are your manners? Usually, your people call my people. My people are dead, Dominic, Arthur said. The static popped. There was no anger in the old man's voice, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was completely hollow. I just got off the phone with the harbour master. Some of your boys were spotted dumping an SUV into the scrap crusher. An SUV registered to a front company I gave my daughter for her 25th birthday. Silence hung heavy in the kitchen. Where is she, Dominic? Arthur asked. The low rumble of his voice vibrated through the small plastic speaker. Dominic calculated the angles. Lying was useless. Deflection was weakness. He met Nora's eyes across the kitchen island. She gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. She's in my basement, Arthur, Dominic said. A heavy exhale came through the line. Is she breathing? For now, she made a mistake, Arthur said slowly, the gears turning in his head. She went after your girl. I told her to let it go. She never listens. Your daughter broke into my home, Dominic said, his voice hardening, the gravel thick and dangerous. She brought a knife. She threatened my family. You know the rules, Arthur. You know what happens now. I know, Arthur replied. The static crackled louder for a second. I have 4 cars idling at the end of your street, Dominic. I brought incendiaries. I brought heavy armor. You have 12 men inside those gates. Dominic's jaw clenched tightly. Arthur had moved faster than he anticipated. The old man hadn't waited for confirmation. He had mobilized at the first sign of trouble. Release her, Dominic, Arthur said. Send her out the front gate. You have exactly 10 minutes. If the gates don't open by then, I am going to level your estate. I'm going to kill every guard you employ. And then I'm going to make you watch while I deal with the woman who put her hands on my blood. The line went dead with a sharp click. The dead dial tone echoed through the kitchen, a sharp, electronic flat line. Dominic reached out and slammed the receiver back onto the wall mount. The plastic housing cracked under the force of his grip. He didn't hesitate. The protective instinct he had harbored for a year dissolved, replaced entirely by the cold, mechanical calculus of a wartime boss. He looked at Nora. Go to the safe room, Dominic ordered, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. It's under the library floorboards. Lock the steel door from the inside. Do not open it for anyone but me or Leo. There are rations and a secure landline. If you don't hear from me in 2 hours, you call the number taped to the underside of the desk. A helicopter will come to the back pasture and take you to Montreal." Nora didn't move. She picked up her coffee mug with her uninjured hand and took another slow, deliberate sip. The dark liquid stained her lips. "No," she said. Dominic crossed the kitchen in 3 massive strides. He planted his hands on the marble island, leaning over it, his shadow swallowing her completely. "This isn't a negotiation, Nora. Arthur has armored vehicles and rifles. He is going to turn the front of this house into a slaughterhouse. You are going into the floor." "And what happens to you?" she asked, her voice eerily calm against his rising fury. "You have 12 men. You try to hold off Arthur's strike team, and you all die on the front steps. He breaches the house, finds the safe room, and torches it to flush me out. Running just delays the inevitable, Dominic. It always does." "I am not letting them put a bullet in you," he snarled. "Then let me work," Nora shot back, slamming her mug onto the counter. The coffee splashed over the rim, pooling on the pristine granite. For the first time, genuine heat flared in her eyes. "You think you're the only one who knows how to survive an execution? Arthur doesn't want a war. He wants his daughter, and he wants his pride intact. If you hide behind your men and let him shoot up your house, he wins. He looks strong, and you look like a coward hoarding a captive." Dominic's jaw tightened. "What are you suggesting?" "We give him his daughter," Nora said flatly. "If I send Vivian out those gates, Arthur has no reason not to kill us all anyway. She's our only leverage." "We don't send her out," Nora corrected, stepping around the island to stand chest to chest with him. "We bring him in. We open the front doors. We invite him onto the porch, and we show him exactly what his daughter did to his truce." Before Dominic could tear the plan apart, the kitchen doors swung open. Leo stood there, and an assault rifle slung over his shoulder, 2 spare magazines clamped in his hands. "Boss, perimeter sensors are tripping," Leo reported, his eyes darting between Dominic and Nora. "We've got movement in the tree line past the gates. Thermal imaging shows at least 20 bodies. They're setting up firing lines. We have maybe 6 minutes before they breach the iron." Dominic looked down at Nora. The exhaustion in her face was completely masked by a terrifying surgical focus. She wasn't the civilian he had sheltered. She was a weapon that had been left in the dark for too long, and now she was fully loaded. "Leo," Dominic said, never breaking eye contact with Nora. "Go down to the basement, get the girl, drag her up to the main foyer." Leo blinked. "Sir?" "Do it," Dominic barked, "and tell the perimeter guards to hold their fire. Nobody shoots unless I give the absolute signal." Leo nodded sharply, turning on his heel and sprinting down the hallway. Dominic reached to the small of his back and unholstered a compact 9mm pistol. He checked the chamber, then flipped the weapon in his hand, offering the grip to Nora. She looked at the gun, then up at him. She didn't take it. "I don't like guns," Nora said softly. "They're too loud. They make people careless." "Take the damn gun, Nora," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "If this goes sideways, I need to know you can put a round through Arthur's skull while I deal with his men." Nora reached out with her bandaged hand. Her split knuckles throbbed as she wrapped her fingers around the textured grip. The weight of the steel felt unnatural, yet familiar in a sick, distant way. She slid the weapon into the waistband of her denim jeans, pulling her black shirt down to conceal it. "Let's go greet our guests," she said. They walked in silence to the grand foyer. The air in the hallway was thick with tension. 3 of Dominic's men were crouched behind the heavy oak pillars, their rifles trained on the closed front doors. Leo emerged from the basement stairwell a moment later. He was practically carrying Vivian. The heiress was a mess of tears and snot. The arrogance she had worn like armor was entirely stripped away, leaving nothing but a pathetic, whimpering shell. When she saw Nora standing next to Dominic, Vivian let out a choked sob and tried to pull back, but Leo's grip on her collar was like a vice. "Drop her," Dominic ordered. Leo let go. Vivian collapsed onto the marble floor, her knees hitting the hard stone with a sickening crack. She curled into a ball, weeping into her bound hands. Nora walked over to her. The three armed guards watched in stunned silence as the quiet, unassuming woman they usually saw arranging flowers knelt beside the bleeding syndicate princess. Nora grabbed a fistful of Vivian's matted blonde hair and yanked her head up. Vivian shrieked, her eyes wide with animal panic. "Listen to me very carefully," Nora whispered, her voice completely devoid of empathy. "Your father is outside. He brought an army. In exactly 3 minutes, those doors are going to open. You are going to stand up. You are going to look him in the eye, and you are going to tell him exactly whose idea it was to break into this house." Nora leaned closer, her lips brushing Vivian's ear. "If you lie, if you play the victim, if you tell him I attacked you unprovoked, I won't wait for the gunfire. I will take the gun out of my waistband, and I will blow your kneecaps off before your father even blinks. Do you understand me?" Vivian sobbed, nodding frantically, her tears mixing with the blood on her chin. I understand, please." Nora released her hair and stood up. She wiped her hand on her jeans, disgusted. Dominic watched her, a dark sense of awe settling heavy in his chest. He turned to Leo. "Open the gates, all of them. Let them pull into the driveway, and unlock the front doors." Leo swallowed hard. "Boss, if we open the doors, we lose all our hard cover." "Open the doors, Leo," Dominic repeated, his voice cold and flat. The heavy electronic deadbolts on the front doors clicked. Dominic stepped forward, grabbing the brass handles. He looked back at Nora one last time. She was standing perfectly straight, her hands loose at her sides, her eyes locked on the wood. Dominic threw the doors open. The fog rolled into the foyer like grey smoke. Out on the driveway, 4 armoured SUVs sat idling in a semicircle around the stone steps, their headlights cutting blinding white arcs through the mist. Behind them, shadows shifted in the tree line. Arthur had brought an army. Dominic stepped out onto the wide stone porch. He didn't raise his hands. He stood there, a massive, immovable force in a tailored suit, the damp wind whipping the fabric around his legs. A moment later, Nora stepped out beside him. She stayed slightly behind his right shoulder, her face passive, her eyes scanning the vehicles with clinical detachment. Finally, Leo pushed Vivian out the door. She stumbled, catching her balance clumsily with her zip-tied wrists. She stood on the edge of the porch, shivering violently in her ruined blouse, blood drying dark on her face. The back door of the lead SUV opened. Arthur stepped out. He leaned heavily on a silver-tipped cane, wearing a thick wool overcoat. His face was weathered, mapped with the scars of a violent youth. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a weary grandfather. That was his most dangerous asset. His grey eyes locked onto his daughter. A flicker of genuine pain crossed his face, instantly swallowed by a hardened, furious mask. Behind him, a dozen men racked the slides of their rifles. The metallic clacking echoed loudly over the engines. "Dominic!" Arthur called out, his voice scraping against the damp air. "You have a lot of nerve standing on that porch." "It's my porch, Arthur," Dominic replied easily. "I have nothing to hide from you." Arthur began a slow, deliberate walk up the driveway. 2 of his enforcers flanked him, their weapons raised and trained squarely on Dominic's chest. Arthur stopped at the base of the stone steps. He looked up at Vivian, examining her broken nose, the purple bruising, the torn clothes. "Who did this to her?" Arthur demanded. The quiet threat was worse than a shout. Dominic didn't speak. He took a half-step back, yielding the floor. Nora stepped forward. She moved smoothly, coming to stand right next to Vivian. The height difference was marginal, but in that moment, Nora cast a long, suffocating shadow. Arthur's gaze shifted to Nora. He frowned, taking in her plain clothes, her bandaged hand, the utter lack of fear. "Who the hell are you?" "I am the woman who lives in this house," Nora said. Her voice carried clearly over the engines. "I am the woman your daughter tried to corner." Arthur let out a low, dark chuckle. "You? You expect me to believe a house mouse beat my enforcer to a pulp?" "Ask her," Nora said, gesturing to the weeping woman beside her. Arthur looked at his daughter. "Vivian, tell me who hit you." Vivian looked down at her father. She saw the heavy rifles. She saw the army. Then she looked at Nora's flat, dead eyes. She remembered the sheer brutality of the fireplace poker. Her shoulders collapsed. "She did, Papa." A murmur rippled through Arthur's men. Arthur stiffened, leaning heavier on his cane. "She did this to you? With what? Did she ambush you?" "No," Vivian choked out, tears spilling over her bruised cheeks. "I pulled a knife. I tried to cut her. She broke my wrist and took me apart." Arthur's face flushed red. "You pulled a knife on a civilian? I told you to stay away from the Gallo estate. I told you the truce was final." "I wanted to hurt him," Vivian sobbed. "I thought she was weak." Arthur closed his eyes for a heavy second. The humiliation was absolute. He had mobilized a strike team, nearly started a war, all because his daughter threw a jealous tantrum and got utterly dismantled by a woman half her size. He opened his eyes and looked at Dominic. "You could have killed her. You had every right." "I don't care about the old laws," Dominic said, stepping forward to stand next to Nora. "I care about the quiet. I care about my territory. And I care about my wife. You want blood for this, Arthur? Call the order. We'll shoot it out right here. But my men in the city have already been given their orders. If I don't call in 5 minutes, they burn your docks to the waterline. We both lose everything, because your daughter couldn't swallow her pride." Arthur stood silent in the fog. He looked at his broken daughter, then at the man he had hated for years, and finally at the quiet woman who had effortlessly broken the rules of their world. He recognized a predator, even one dressed in faded denim. Arthur sighed. It was the sound of an old man tired of cleaning up childish messes. He tapped his cane twice against the asphalt. Behind him, the enforcers lowered their rifles. "Cut her loose," Arthur said gruffly. Nora reached into her pocket, pulled out Dominic's silver folding knife, and expertly sliced the plastic zip ties. Vivian gasped and practically fell down the stone steps into her father's guards. Arthur looked at her with pure disgust. "Put her in the car," he ordered. He looked back up at Dominic. "The truce holds. But if you ever cross my borders again, Gallo, I won't bother knocking." "Likewise, Arthur." Arthur turned and walked back to his SUV. The doors slammed shut. One by one, the armored vehicles threw themselves in reverse, their tires crunching loudly against the gravel as they vanished into the morning fog. The silence that fell over the estate was deafening. Dominic stood on the porch, his heart slamming against his ribs. The adrenaline was receding. He turned to look at Nora. She was staring out into the fog, still holding the silver knife. Her shoulders dropped. The steel armor was cracking. "Nora," Dominic breathed. She looked up at him. The cold apex predator was gone. He just saw his partner, exhausted, battered, but still standing. "I think," Nora whispered, a weary smile touching her mouth, "we're going to need a new coffee table." The heavy iron gates groaned as they swung shut, their motorized hinges whining in the damp morning air. The metallic clang of the lock engaging echoed across the empty driveway, sealing out the fog and the lingering exhaust fumes of Arthur's motorcade. Dominic didn't move until the red security light on the gate control panel flipped back to solid green. He exhaled, a long, ragged breath that seemed to pull all the tension out of his massive frame. He turned to Leo. The lieutenant was standing near the pillars, his rifle finely lowered, staring at Nora with a mixture of profound shock and newfound reverence. "Tell the men to stand down," Dominic ordered, his voice returning to its normal, gravelly bass line. "Double the perimeter watch for the next 48 hours. Nobody gets off shift, but double their pay, too. Have someone patch up Frankie and tell him he still has a job." Leo nodded sharply. "Yes, boss. And the drawing room?" "Leave it," Dominic said. "I'll handle it." Leo backed away, disappearing around the side of the estate to wrangle the guards. Dominic looked down at Nora. She was leaning heavily against the stone doorframe, staring blankly at the silver folding knife still resting in her palm. Her adrenaline had completely crashed. She looked fragile again. But Dominic knew better now. He knew that the fragility was just a sheath for the forged steel underneath. He reached out, wrapping his large hand over hers. He gently took the knife, folded the blade shut with a soft click, and slipped it into his own pocket. "Come inside," he said softly. They walked back into the foyer. The house was dead quiet. The destruction of the morning felt distant now, a violent fever dream that had broken with the dawn. Dominic locked the ruined front doors as best as he could, throwing the heavy deadbolts. Nora didn't walk toward the kitchen. She turned and walked slowly back into the drawing room. Dominic followed her. The room was a disaster zone. The shattered coffee table glittered on the Persian rug. The silk curtains lay in heaps. Vivian's blood stained the floorboards near the fireplace. It was the physical manifestation of the lie they had both been living. Nora walked over to the leather wingback chair and carefully sat down. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on her uninjured hand. She looked incredibly tired. Dominic didn't sit. He walked over to the fireplace. The heavy iron poker still lay on the hearth, its tip coated in dried crimson. He picked it up. The iron was cold and heavy. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his suit pocket and methodically wiped the blood from the metal. "You lied to me for a year," Dominic said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded contemplative. Nora watched him. "I omitted the truth. There's a difference." "Not in my line of work," Dominic countered, setting the clean poker back into its brass stand. He tossed the ruined handkerchief into the unlit fireplace. He turned to face her, leaning his shoulders against the heavy oak mantelpiece. "I ran a background check on you, Nora. I had my best people look into your life before the gallery. They found nothing. No ex-husband, no trail of broken ribs. Nothing." "I told you," she whispered, her voice rough. "I learned how to disappear. The man who hurt me had money. He had influence. If I didn't erase myself completely, he would have found me. I bought a new birth certificate in Chicago. I built a ghost." Dominic crossed his arms over his chest. "If you wanted a quiet life, if you wanted to hide from a violent man, why the hell did you let me take you to dinner? You knew what I was the second I walked into that gallery. You knew the name Gallo. You knew I was worse than whatever ex you were running from." Nora let out a dry, humorless laugh. She looked down at her lap, picking absently at a loose thread on her denim jeans. "I didn't want you despite what you are, Dominic," Nora said, looking up to meet his eyes. The raw honesty in her gaze pinned him to the spot. "I wanted you because of it." Dominic frowned. "Explain that." "My ex was a coward," Nora said, the words bitter and sharp. "He hid his cruelty behind closed doors. He smiled at the neighbors and then broke my jaw in the kitchen. When I met you didn't hide anything. You are exactly what you appear to be. A monster. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. But you're a monster with rules, she continued quietly. You protect what is yours. I didn't want a nice, safe man who would freeze the moment the world got ugly. I wanted a man who could scare the monsters away. I chose you because I knew, if that man ever found me again, you would bury him. The absolute pragmatism of her logic hit Dominic like a physical weight. She hadn't been a naive civilian swept off her feet by a dangerous mobster. She had been a survivor, calculating her odds, choosing the biggest predator in the room to stand behind. You used me as a shield, Dominic said. Yes, Nora admitted freely. She didn't flinch. And you used me as an anchor. You wanted a normal woman to prove to yourself that you weren't completely lost to the dark. We both played a part, Dominic. Dominic looked at her. He looked at the split skin on her knuckles, the exhaustion carving hollows under her eyes, the sheer, unyielding iron in her spine. He thought about the panic he had felt driving home, terrified that he would find her broken. He realized, with a sudden, profound clarity, that he preferred this. He didn't want a glass doll. He wanted the woman who had stood on the porch and stared down an army. Dominic walked across the ruined room. He stopped in front of her chair, reaching down to take her uninjured hand. He pulled her gently to her feet. No more shields, Dominic said, his voice a low, heavy rumble in the quiet room. No more anchors. No more ghosts. Nora looked up at him, a genuine, tired smile finally breaking through her cold mask. What does that leave us? Partners, Dominic said. He cupped the back of her neck, pulling her in, and pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was hard, bruised, and tasting of stale coffee and survival. It was a promise signed in the wreckage of their old life. When he finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, the shadows in the room didn't seem so cold anymore. Come on, Dominic murmured, his thumb stroking her jawline. Let's go clean the blood off the floor. And that is the thrilling conclusion to Nora and Dominic's story. What did you think of Nora's ultimate confession? Was she right to hide her dark past and use Dominic for protection? Or was it a dangerous gamble that finally paid off? I absolutely loved seeing them transition from a lie into a true, ruthless partnership. Drop a comment below and let me know your favorite moment from the standoff with Arthur. If you enjoyed this gritty mafia romance, please smash that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more intense audio stories. See you next time.